Welcome to Health Reform 2.0, the only place on the internet for people with a curious mind and a desire for a better healthcare system. Here we take you on a journey of our current quagmire, tell you where it came from and why the government can't fix it. Along the way, we'll tell you some history, bust a few big myths, tell you a few stories, and give you an idea how we can work together and get the healthcare system we want. Let's get started. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Health Reform 2.0. I'm your host, Tom Loker, and I'm here actually again in person with Tim Henning. We're making a habit of this. I think this is a good way to be.
Yep.
And we're here to talk to you about our latest episode. And I told Tim before we started this show, I wanted to bring up, we got a letter from one of our listeners. Her name is Lucy Timmons. In truth and honesty, her middle name is Loker. She's my sister. But her letter says this. She says, Tom, in the last episode, all I can say is yes. The character in there is definitely you. Now you know why our father called you a whippersnapper when you were young. She says, the definition of whippersnapper is a young person who annoys older people, who is very confident, and is always acting like someone important. The word whippersnapper originated from the term snipper snappers in the late 17th century. The meaning of whippersnapper originally referred to a young male who had no ambition or get up and go. Throughout the years, the term whippersnapper became synonymous with a young person who had an excess of impudence and ambition. The term may also have been derived from those habits of young people who idled away their daily time by sitting around snapping horsewhips. So, my sister concludes with, this definitely was you. And she also says, by the way, I really enjoyed the latest podcast. Love you, Lucy. So please send in these things. These are great. And we learn something new every day. So you were right. I was a whippersnapper, and I got snapped a lot.
And I think you got your snapper whipped many times.
I did, and probably rightly so.
Yep.
So do you want to take a moment and tell the audience what we're going to tell them, so to speak, so we can walk them through our history here?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for having me over. Beautiful day, beautiful setup. I like this. So today we're going to be focusing on, this is titled Episode 1.8. And this is coming from your Chapter 6 in your book, The History and Evolution of Healthcare in America. But we're going to break this one up a little bit because there's a lot of meat in this chapter. So we're going to take this from 1950 to 1964 today as our first part. This actually is got a lot more content that we'll go into 2 more episodes on following this one. But we're going to narrow this down to 1950 to 1964. And the title of this is The Rise of the Disinfected, the Disillusioned, and the Entitled Generation. That would be me, sort of. Sort of. Never was entitled, but I was disillusioned. So,
and probably disaffected as well.
Yeah, probably to a certain extent, but we'll get into that. So, Professor Jeffrey Jones is a professor at Harvard Business School, published a paper entitled Restoring a Global Economy 1950 to 1980. In it, he states, quote, the 1950s onward was the beginning of the reconstruction of a new global economy. The annual GDP growth averaged around 5% and was relatively smooth. World War II left the United States in a uniquely powerful position. We can talk a little bit more about that because we came out of World War II really unaffected because of our, the oceans between us and the fact that everyone else was devastated, and we had really the only manufacturing capability left. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. They did catch up, which we'll talk about as well. The U.S. dollar became the world's most major reserve currency, and U.S. Corporations assumed a leading role in many industries. We'll talk more about the dollar later as well, because we talked about it before.
And as we said in the last episode, by the time we got out of the war and hit into the 1950s, we had 80% of the gold reserves in the world.
That's right. And we've talked about this before because as Europe and Japan came out of their quagmire, which we helped build them out of, it started affecting us more than they probably expected it would.
Exactly.
Quoting again from Professor Jones, the emergence of a U.S. deficit and the devaluation of the U.S. dollar and its convertibility to gold in 1972 provided symbolic signs of the ending of an era, end quote. Mm-hmm. So, Tom, we're about to enter an era that I know has special meaning and history to myself, and I assume for you as well.
Yep.
And in preparing for this episode, it brought back many suppressed memories, more than I expected. I was born in 1952, graduated from high school in 1970, and entered into the U.S. Armed Services the same year. There was a draft, if you remember. I know you do. So this period was a major period that changed our country, our faith in government, our leaders, and quite frankly, myself. Mm-hmm. The assassination of a president, the Great Society, the Vietnam War, civil unrest, which I remember like yesterday, the new American drug culture, which we still see today, free love, which I was fine with, the establishment of Medicare.
It wasn't free either.
No, it wasn't free.
Yeah.
Believe me, it's never free. The establishment of Medicare and the rise of the HMO forever set the foundation of today's issues that not only set the stage for today's healthcare industry, but America in general. Mm-hmm. Before we begin this period of history, can you give me your high-level thoughts of this period and how it affected you?
Sure. Well, the changes in this period had a very large effect, not just on me, but on the healthcare system that we have today. It's during this period that you and I were born and started to grow up that we seeded the roots of the culture that we have today, particularly when it comes to the culture we have around healthcare and our belief in this system. Many of those beliefs are unfounded and mythical, but it really started to have roots in this period. After World War II, the GIs were coming back home to their jobs, but these jobs had largely been performed by women when they were overseas, and many of the women were the wives of the men that had been serving overseas. So women had been very happy prior to the war in the role of wife and housekeeper and mother, and primarily because there was little expectation for a woman to do anything other than that. They didn't have any expectation, any vision of something they would do other than be a wife, a housekeeper, and a mother. So they were comfortable, they were happy, but the war kind of disrupted that. While the war sent the men off to fight in this new role as soldier and protector of the realm, women went to work to support the war effort and provide for the family. And in doing so, they became empowered. And in many cases, they found more new fulfilling roles in society. So when the men returned at the end of the war, women were once again pressured to return to their prior role of wife, housekeeper, and mother. Mm-hmm. And, many women weren't really comfortable going back to the domestic role after having a fulfilling occupation, going off and earning a living and finding validation in a day-to-day job. So society wasn't providing them an acceptable outlook to go back to stay in the role they wanted. Society was pressuring them to stay in the role of wife, housekeeper, and mother. And for that, it created a conflict. And that conflict led to an acceptable outlet. Many turned to alcohol at the time and started to drink, as did the men. But there was also a new chemistry that had come out at the end of the war that was called an amphetamine, uppers. It was also in the period of the 1950s sold as a diet pill. And these diet pills started to reintroduce America into a new addiction era. And the first people, once again, that were being pushed by society into this, not on purpose, were the women.
So I assume I can understand it's hard to go from being Rosie the Riveter to Rosie the housekeeper.
Exactly.
So the men came back. They had been through a tough time. And now things have changed.
Yep.
And they come back to a different type of situation that they were away from for a period of time, sometimes more than a year, 2 years, whatever it was. So how did they feel about this when they came back, do you think?
Well, that's a really good question. And the men returning from war that had to restart their lives and deal with all the emotional baggage of seeing the horrors of their war. But this was a different time. And the men in that period of time's own roles in society were different than they are today. Men weren't sensitive. Men were raised to be stoic and rigid. And for a lot of them, this change in the relationship with their wife when they returned started to become a bit more of a problem. And as a result of that, it was very disconcerting to the men. They weren't very happy about having to come back and think about fighting a woman to get their job back.
And this was just the beginning of that.
Very beginning,
and
right.
So there was a lot of changes. I remember from the horrors of war, and actually now that I kind of dig into the memory banks, now I got a better understanding of how my father behaved, how my uncle behaved, and both served in the Pacific Rim. Mm-hmm. My uncle was on a destroyer, and it was sunk during the late Gulf War, I believe. Mm-hmm. He floated around out there for days before they were picked up, and most of his shipmates died eaten by sharks.
Yep.
And so I go back to the things that he talked about. He had a hard time, real hard time coping. So how did these guys cope with this stuff?
Well, like many people today, and like people in the wars before them, when they came back home, some of them found jobs and pushed themselves into the job. They appeared to have a booming economy. Everything seemed to be going great. They had a GI Bill to help them go to college. But to cope with the stresses, like the women, many of the men started to rely back on alcohol again. And some were using the same prior coping mechanisms from the 1890s and 1900s. They turned to morphine, cocaine, and cannabis. But it wasn't quite as easy to come by as a result of some of the changes in the rules. But these innovative, inventive, can-do men that came back from the war found ways to get that stuff and find it. And there began a subculture of drugs and addiction in America.
Which brings up a question of mine. We've been familiar with cocaine, morphine. We talked about the main components of patent medicine. This has been around for a long time, still is. Mm-hmm. When was LSD first introduced? Because I remember it mostly in the late 60s. Is that true?
Well, the LSD was a result of a series of experimentations in trying to find painkillers. And in researching painkillers, they found hallucinogenics that were similar to some of the things, some of the effects you would get out of morphine or heroin, but this became on steroids. And of course, you remember Timothy Leary and these guys that came out with LSD. And then there was also evidence today now that this is not a conspiracy theory, but there were government programs that were trying to see if they could use LSD as a tool of war. We didn't know much about it at the beginning. We didn't know much about the damage it could cause psychologically, the physical changes it can cause in the actual brain of people that use it. But LSD became another product of the era. It was a little later than 64. But, our government did take a look at it and did try to figure out what to do with it. And it was one of the other reasons that people were becoming disaffected and distrustful.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the whole thing with marijuana at some point, because it's the same sort of thing. And by the way, if you couldn't use LSD, just go out and find some mushrooms.
Yes, indeed. Well, we're in the West Coast. Peyote's out here. They don't have it back on the East Coast, unfortunately for them.
So back to the GI Bill. This was a great help for the veterans who came back, and many took advantage of it and used it to improve their lives and their earning potential. Mm-hmm. In your book, you talk about this, how it set the stages for the 1960s. Can you go over that a little bit with us?
Right. Well, as the people came back from the war, many of these guys had gone through some or most of high school before they entered World War II as a soldier. So they had had some education prior to when we started to change our education system to really emphasize American exceptionalism. In other words, rewrite our own histories. So the history they got was more unadulterated. So as these guys came back from war, and as many of them went to college, they were now getting full-on doses of the new version of American history, the new version of American exceptionalism. And they were studying at school. We had the Korean War come up. They started to listen to some of the propaganda that the government and the press was saying about the war. They weren't here during World War II, remember? They were fighting in the European and Japanese theaters. But now they're actually hearing what we're saying in the U.S. about war, and it's not jiving all that well with their own memories. So it started to sow the seeds of mistrust in this population that returned. And it wasn't that these guys sat around and said, hey, you know, I'm learning in history that we've been a great nation and had all this money, but I remember before that we had a series of times when the U.S. was struggling economically. They never had these discussions. It wasn't that clear cut. They were just things that started to build up, and it inculcated in a philosophy of distrust of government and a growing distrust of authority in general. And some of these returning vets went on to graduate school and became PhDs and college professors themselves. So by the time you get to the late 1950s and early 1960s, a few of these men were now very distrustful of government and authority, and they were infusing into their education to these new college students this distrust and skepticism of authority. And this really became the birthplace of a new radicalization of America. And by the early 1960s, we were now entering into the third generational war in Vietnam, third in terms of those people that had been there from World War II to Korea to Vietnam. And this concept of don't trust anyone over 30, beware of the man, turn on, tune in, and drop out, really is a direct result of this change, going back to the change in history and the guys returning from war and the pressures deep-seated in our cultural psyche that started to work against them as they came forward, and really is what developed this massive distrust that we still, to some extent, have today of government and everything else.
Oh, I think it's even more pervasive today.
Yeah.
As we've seen some of the things develop of late, to be honest.
Right.
Back to one point you made about the history.
Mm-hmm.
We've been doing this, man has been doing this from the get-go, from the very first chronicles of war.
Right.
From the Carthaginians to the Parthians. Now, if you look at Julius Caesar, he wrote his own commentaries and sent those back. You think they might have been a little twisted?
Oh, no, not at all.
Not at all.
What would make you think that?
No.
You think that the guys fighting a war want everybody to think it's all hunky-dory?
Well, and all the things that could be possibly true, we don't know because the sources aren't there. The same thing with Alexander the Great.
Right.
He had a bunch of scribes running around writing, and no one's going to say anything bad about the guy, right? But there's more to the story.
Well, you know, history is always written by the victor.
That's right. Every time. So we talked about Franklin Roosevelt quite a bit in the last episode. We talked about him thinking war was coming, some conspiracies about why he moved the fleet to Pearl Harbor and so forth. Mm-hmm. But one thing we haven't talked about is the fact that for many schemes were employed to keep the public from finding out that he had polio. Yep. He was paralyzed. They went to a great deal of effort to do that. And
it had to have been massive because he was severely afflicted with polio most of his period as a president.
Right. And so he didn't have anything different than some of the most common presidents we have had lately and probably have today, is that he also had a mistress who was his personal secretary. I don't know if people really know that. His wife just put up with it.
As many women did in that period of time.
Exactly. It was an amazing story. So polio was, out of doubt, the scourge of this era. An epidemic swept the nation from 1949, and I don't think it was eradicated in 1970 or thereabouts.
Well, it's still not eradicated completely. Right. We still have polio in the world, very little in the U.S., although we're starting to see some come back.
Yeah, so it affected, I think, over 30,000, could have been more in the United States. Kind of give us a little bit of background and what that was, and because I surely do remember the iron lungs, I'll tell you that.
Well, poliomyelitis, also known as infantile paralysis, had been around for a while. But polio was really a pandemic. And when you and I were kids, it was rampant throughout the United States. People were deathly afraid of it. It was growing. As you said, FDR had polio, but no one in America knew it until years after his presidency. But we grew up with iron lungs. I remember going to the hospital. I know you do as well. Mm-hmm. And there were iron lungs in the hallways of hospitals. They would have wards set up with iron lungs. And it was a horrible place for people to be that had polio. They were in a long steel tube with a rubber membrane around their neck that literally created a vacuum so that they could breathe. Without it, they would have died of suffocation. And people that had polio were pushed into these things, and some of them existed in them for many years. So think about being in a jail cell that's literally twice the size of a bathtub, and the only thing sticking out is your head. And you're laying down, looking up at the ceiling with a mirror in front of you so you could see the people behind you. It was a horrible way to live a life. And very few people at the beginning were able, once they got full-on polio, to be able to be cured of polio. But in 1950, a guy named William Hammond, who was at the University of Pittsburgh, suggested that there was a component of blood plasma that he thought you could extract and then give that to patients as a way to immunize them against polio. That was called gamma globulin. And it was a great idea, but the problem was harvesting enough gamma globulin to use as a vaccine was impractical. It was difficult and impractical and expensive. So 1950, a woman named Hilary Kaprowski, who was a virologist in Europe, gave a prototype of a vaccine that she was building to an 8-year-old boy in Poland. And between 1958 and 1960, 7 million children in Poland were successfully treated with this vaccine. So it worked. There were issues with it. There were some other things. It wasn't completely perfect, but at least it worked, and it worked in some semblance of treatment of these children. It was not 100% effective. But in 1955, Jonas Salk, who we all now have heard his name, developed an improved vaccination with 2 doses that became 90% effective. And many of us still have the scars on our left arm.
There it is.
From the times, the needles that they would literally, in the early days, literally stick in your arm in a circle to infect you with this polio vaccine that would then give you the immunization that would allow your body to fight off that disease. And then in 1962, Albert Sabin developed an oral vaccine, and Tim and I came through well after that, and we were still getting the Tyne vaccine. But the oral vaccine, which is what is still in use worldwide today. Now, one last point about vaccines and polio. There is a strong tendency to say we've cured polio, like we say we've cured the plague and we've cured smallpox and we've cured whooping cough. But we haven't really cured them. They still exist. Vaccination does not mean you never get the disease. It means that you have immunized your body, you have taken your body's immune system and given it the ability to fight off those diseases. Doesn't mean you don't get them. It doesn't even mean you might not get sick from them. Most people have had a polio infection and a smallpox and others, and it may have just felt like close to nothing, a slight fever, or maybe the cold and the flu. And it felt the same. So they still exist, and vaccinations are still very important because they are immunizing us going forward. And that immunity is not genetically inherited. So if we don't have them, we will have another polio epidemic and other epidemics.
You know, remember the basic training AIT. I don't want to talk too much about this, but I want to talk about the vaccinations because you got on these long lines, and most of the time they use these guns. And we don't know what we were getting vaccinated with. But many people, not majority, but quite a few, a platoon, you may have 7, 8 guys in the platoon will have a severe reaction or will get sick. I saw it occur all the time, to your point. So it's not something that's foolproof, although, and I can ask you this question, there's a big pushback and there's groups that don't want their kids immunized today. I have my feelings on it. I think it's absolutely stupid if you don't. I think it endangers them and the public, but you're seeing more and more people push back on that.
Yeah, and it's a big movement today. And look, vaccinations have side effects. There are people who get sick from them. Many of the side effects that are being attributed are not true. but there are side effects that are true. But the overall point is really probably more irrelevant than you think. People that are not having their children vaccinated, they may think they're doing their children a service by not getting them a vaccination. And maybe they are, maybe they are not. But the issue is it's not about the individual at that point. It is about society. It's about the species. And we have people today that have not vaccinated their children that are now showing up in hospitals in the United States on a reasonably regular series of occurrences that have things like smallpox or whooping cough or chicken pox. And the people that are treating them, the young physicians that are manning the emergency rooms, many have never seen these diseases. So they're not easily diagnosable the way they used to be. And in some cases, these children that come in that now have these diseases are infecting a number of other adults in the room that may have been vaccinated years ago with a form of the disease that has evolved a little bit and may or may not be now resistant to the immunization that you have in your body.
Yeah, you can go get the flu shot today, and some people develop the flu.
A large percentage of people, 35% of people that get the flu vaccine will develop a flu symptom. It may not be quite as bad, but I know people that have had the flu vaccine, a number of people have had the flu vaccine that will be sick for 1 or 2 days. Not as bad, but they do get it. And as we said before, the flu vaccine that's in circulation today is only about 26% effective. It's less effective than the one last year. And we don't know yet what's going to happen in this next cycle, but it's likely going to continue to become less and less effective.
Yeah, I haven't seen the stats lately, but this last episode was pretty hard. I mean, we hit a lot of people. There's new data out. I haven't read it yet.
Yep.
So here we go again. We're going to move on to a common theme. War, and more war. So on June 25th, 1950, communist North Korea invaded South Korea. President Truman declared the U.S. intervention a police action. Mm-hmm. Sound familiar?
Oh, yeah. A lot of police in the world. We're in military uniforms.
Mostly us.
Yeah.
It's a very poor description to what was not only the first major conflict of the Cold War, but also America's longest running and most expensive conflict up until today's present Middle East. Mm-hmm. So for those of us that grew up watching Hot Lips Houlihan, Hawkeye, and Radar, this is where many of us first heard the term MASH unit. So we're all familiar with MASH. Did you know where the theme song from MASH came from?
No, other than heard it on television.
Sure. So
I know it was "Suicide is Painless."
"Suicide is Painless" was when the doctor, whoever his name was, I don't remember him. I didn't like him. He wasn't my favorite.
He was Bone Crusher. He was the tooth guy, wasn't
he? That's right.
Yeah.
He was going to do this fake suicide, and they sang the song. So the producer at the time, and I don't remember his name. This was a low budget start, and he got paid a small amount of money to produce this movie. I think it was less than $500,000. So they're in the process of this, and they wrote the script and whatnot. And then he realized he needed a theme song. Well, he didn't know what to do. He didn't have a large budget, but his son, I think he was 18 or 19 at the time, was a musician. He played around writing some songs and stuff. And he said, well, I'll pay you a few $100 to write a theme song for MASH. So this kid sat down in less than 1 hour, which I understand is not uncommon for musicians, wrote the theme song for MASH. Mm-hmm. Suicide is Painless.
Yeah.
Remember that? Yeah. Everyone's heard that.
Yeah.
You know how much money that kid's made on the royalties from that song?
I'm sure he made a whole hell of a lot more than his father made for producing the movie, because royalties on music pay for 70-some years.
No question about it. So take a minute, Tom, and describe these MASH units, lessons learned by the surgeons in the field, which we talked about the Civil War ahead of time as well. Mm-hmm. We've always learned something. And how it helped form the foundation of our current emergency room practice today.
Well, MASH units, and MASH stands for Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, first were established in 1945, but they didn't get widely deployed during World War II They were tried a little bit, but they didn't have an infrastructure. They really didn't have a plan to get these things moved around. And the idea of the mass unit was not inculcated into the order of battle of a unit going into war. Yeah. So they had a little bit of deployment, but not a lot. They were widely deployed and perfected, though, during the Korean War. Right. And what we learned in World War I and even more in World War II is the amount of time from the trauma itself to getting a soldier back to care. The shorter the time, the higher the incidence of survival of the wound in general, and the better the likelihood of repair of a wound and giving the person a more normal life thereafter. And in World War II, we developed ambulances, and we would evacuate the wounded right up next to the war and take them back to where they could get to a hospital. Those times in transit might have been sometimes as minimum of a half an hour, and more often than not, they were between an hour and 2 hours and maybe more to get them back to where they could actually be treated effectively. But during the Korean War, we learned to use helicopters. And we had these small helicopters that would be able to fly in and pick up right next to the battlefield up to 2 soldiers and bring them back to this mobile Army surgical hospital that was typically 4 to 5 miles behind the line. Mm-hmm. And we could get them back there in sometimes as little as 15 minutes and on a normal basis in about a half an hour. And as a result of that, we were able to be very effective at increasing the survival rate and providing less long-term damage to the soldier who had been injured or wounded. The second thing that happened, which became very controversial, was this concept of triage. Because the idea at the beginning of this was physicians, as they came into these new units, wanted to treat everybody that got to the door.
Sure did.
And it became very clear very quickly that some of these soldiers were critically wounded, fatally wounded, and they were not going to survive. And surgeons had to come up with a way to quickly evaluate the care that a person needed, his likelihood of viability, and rank them in order of those most likely to survive went to surgery or went to the most severe remediation first. Those that weren't quite as critical would sit in the second tier that would be carried in later. And those that were fatal and had a fatal wound that was nothing to be done, they were set aside. And initially, the physicians that entered these units resisted this. It was very controversial. But very shortly at the beginning of the Korean War, it became clear it was effective. And even though emotionally it was upsetting, it was the right way to do. So triage came about, and that's used today in emergency rooms still today. In fact, the concept of a level 1 trauma center that we have today is really built around the lessons we learned in MASH units. One of the other techniques that came up during the war that becomes very important as we move into the mid-60s and 70s is there was a surgeon that was there named Dr. Michael DeBakey. And during the Korean War, he perfected being able to repair damaged arteries in both cardiac-related issues and arms and limbs, major arteries, to repair these arteries. And he developed the techniques to do that initially to minimize amputations. And it is the techniques that he learned during the Korean War in MASH units that gave him the skills necessary to be able to transplant a human heart. So a lot of value has come out of the Korean War and has come out of war in general when it comes to healthcare, and particularly when it comes to mechanical repair of defects from trauma.
Interesting, because I read a book, I can't remember the exact name of it, but it had to do with war. What is it good for? Remember the song, the 70s. However, this gentleman makes the case that there are things that come out of war that are helpful.
Sure.
So one of the things we've learned through discussions about everything from our beginnings with the Revolutionary War to the Civil War to World War II to Korea, and we're going to talk about Vietnam a little bit. There's been great contributions come from what we learned in the treatment of trauma.
Right.
And we mentioned this before. When we talk about healthcare in general, we're talking about disease and management of disease. Mm-hmm. One thing to be clear again, we've done a fairly good job in figuring out how to fix stuff that's fixable, that's been damaged through trauma, car wrecks, and things like that.
Yeah. Much of the advances we've had in healthcare from the 1800s to today, the ones that are really definable and recognizable come in the form of some form of mechanical intervention.
Mechanical, yeah.
Many of the biochemical, chemical, microbiological interventions have been successful, but often they've been successful for short periods of time, and the organisms that they were effective against is adapted. But the mechanical things we've learned to do have been phenomenal, extending human life.
Yeah, we're going to get into that when we will have a segment, maybe on Healthy Bites or something, that we'll talk about my experience in orthopedic surgery. And there's some good stuff, but wait till the audience hears what really goes on in that industry. They'll be shocked. If you have an artificial hip or a knee, you want to listen into this, or if you're considering one, we'll give you plenty of warning when that particular segment comes up. So let's move on, because another thing that developed in this period of time that is with us today, and it was a profound effect. And we'll talk about Vietnam a little bit later, because this was the war made for this new development, or the new development made for this war. I don't know exactly which you look at it, but I remember it specifically. So let's talk about the television, the people's medium. So in 1927, the Federal Radio Commission, now the FCC, granted the first television broadcast license. And by 1946, there were about 6,000 television sets in the United States. I remember as a child watching this little black and white thing. It must have been in 1955 or 1956, sitting in our room all gathered around that little thing versus the radio, which we listened to before. I remember it vividly. So by the end of 1949, there were over 10 million television sets, which, by the way, that's not a lot either. Today, and I thought this was on the short side. The estimate for the United States is about 118 million television sets.
Yeah, but remember, these are television sets. They're not laptop computers that play these things. They're not cell phones that play them. They're not tablets that play them. It's just the wall-mounted TV, the way you and I grew up knowing and loving it.
So you'll love this. You know, a new car I just bought yesterday or the day before. On the back of the headrest and the front seat, there's two little flat screens. But guess what? They're hooked up through the Wi-Fi, because the Wi-Fi is on the MiFi that goes through the cellular tower. The kids can pull up, or the grandkids can pull up Netflix, all sorts of stuff, and watch it from the car.
Isn't it amazing? But you can't.
Yeah, I'm too busy.
Too busy trying to stay on the road.
Too busy trying to drive and not end up a victim. So this people's medium had a profound effect. We talked about in the past, the patent medicine folks' use of the newspapers, the newspaper barons. We talked about almanacs. We talked about wrappers. So now we have a whole new way of looking at things, and it's had a very big effect, and we still see the effects today.
Oh yeah. It's to a great extent the 1950s were when the pharmaceutical companies, which are now ethical pharmaceutical companies, that, as you said a second ago, were the patent medicine men of the 1800s and the 1900s. And they were using their sell sheets, which became newspapers, and their pamphlets and their almanacs to push these products into literally America's gullet that were not very good for us. By the time you get up into the 1950s in television, advertising, in-show promotional spots, and product-based television shows replaced almanacs and pamphlets and sell sheets. And it wasn't initially pharmaceutical companies, because in the 1950s and 60s, ethical pharmaceutical companies were still fighting in America for legitimacy. And the term ethical wasn't quite there yet, because there were still some patent medicines problems existing in that period of time. So they weren't really as out there at advertising in those days. But you did have the tobacco companies.
Only a bird in a gilded cage, a beautiful sight to view. So dainty and delicate you seemed, no rights would they give to you. When you said you should vote, and you said you should smoke, the men were all in a rage. The way of the world said you should remain a bird in a gilded cage. You've come a long way, baby, to get where you got to today.
Virginia Slims. This is the taste for today's woman, with rich Virginia flavor you'll like. Tailored slim for your hands, for your lips.
You've got Virginia Slims now, baby. You've come a long, long way.
And if you go back and you look at the 50s, there was Texaco Theater with Milton Berle. There was the Lucky Strike Hour, which was Lucky Strike, for you that don't know, was a cigarette. And these shows were the shows that were coming out, and they became the vehicle. The show became secondary, and still today, that the shows for the broadcast channels are a cost item. They buy them, but they make their money on advertising and sponsorship. So it's not really much different today for television than it was for newspapers in those days. The second thing that happened in that period of time is most of us today have seen the TV show Mad Men that a few years ago was very popular. And I remember when it was coming on that people would say to me, oh, it couldn't have been like that. That has to be made up. And it was.
It wasn't made up, let me tell you. No.
The problem of that period of time, and remember, many of these people, the main character in Mad Men had been in the war, Korean War, and come back. And they were suffering from problems, and they were still reliant on alcohol and other things to keep them able to function in society. And what happened is American society, as a result of this, inculcated alcohol into our day-to-day life.
Correct.
So Mad Men is literally what happened. So, daily drinking, smoking cigarettes, all that stuff, every single day was part of this culture.
Right, and guess what? Mad Men still exists today.
Oh, yeah.
You know why? Because the best example is the United States Congress.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, they still have alcohol in their office. They still go out for afternoon martinis, and they do all the same things that in the 50s and 60s were commonplace. And I know your father was a physician, and physicians didn't really have the same kind of lifestyle because they spent their days really dealing with patients all day. They didn't have the days to wine and dine clients and go to lunch and have 2 or 3 martinis. But my father was a lawyer, in partnership with his uncle, who was also my uncle, which was also a lawyer. And they had alcohol in their office, and they smoked all day. And when my father came home, he had drinks, as everyone did. And as you get into this period of time, you've got the women who, remember now, we said after the war, they were being pushed back into domestic role. And TV was playing a large role in pushing women back down into that box. These people were really trying to show women in commercials that were waiting for the husband to come home and had a couple shots of Geritol, which was mostly alcohol. And when the husband walked through the door, the kids were away and they were quiet. They had on white gloves, were made up, had their dress on, and they had a drink in their hand to give the husband and a lit cigarette. And this was the culture we were driving into women. My sister, who's older than I am, grew up in the period of time, and this was kind of the wife that she was being trained to become, and she resisted it and didn't, and neither did my other sister, right. But this was the culture. This is what we were doing, and it was a very traumatic time. Smoking and drinking became the release for women and for men. It became part of what we did. And the alcohol use of the 60s really redefined what alcoholism was in the 60s, and it's actually now shifted back. Alcoholism is much more widely seen today, but there were functional alcoholics through the late 50s and 60s that no one thought had a problem because everybody did that. And in 1964, the Surgeon General published a report on smoking that actually linked smoking to cancer. There had been links of cancer and smoking, lung cancer and smoking, way before 1964, but we did little about it. But in 1964, the Surgeon General published a report that showed a very clear link between smoking cigarettes, using tobacco, and the incidence of lung cancer.
Yeah.
So why did it take us till 1974 and C. Everett Koop before he put out to America that smoking caused cancer and forced the cigarette companies to put that on the package?
I'm not sure, but I'm going to have a theory. And the theory has to do with multiple things, I think. One, lobby, money,
Right.
advertising.
Yep.
And we finally got a Surgeon General that was courageous.
True. And then the other issue that took place, and it still exists today, Tim and I can tell you stories, and probably will in a future episode, about women's breast cancer and dense breasts and laws relating to the disclosure of dense breast and the inability to detect cancer in a woman's breast who is composed of dense breast tissue. But in those days, it is clear, this isn't hidden, it is clear that one of the reasons they didn't go out nationally and tell everybody about the link between lung cancer and smoking was because they had just passed Medicare and Medicaid. And if they had started to disclose a direct link, the impact of the cost of health care for smokers who were now going to find out if they had cancer would have increased the roles of enrollment in treatment in Medicaid and Medicare, and would have massively caused an increase in cost, which it actually did in 74. And frankly, we have seen that in our modern era with women with breast cancer where dense breast laws have been passed. In California, they finally passed the dense breast legislation after vetoing it for 3 years. And when they did, as was expected, Medi-Cal, which is California's Medicaid, went up significantly as a result of more people coming in finding out they had to be treated for this.
We'll go into that in detail. I think that's another Healthy Bites one because it's a very important topic. We were going to show, and this is equally important for men because they love their wives. This is extremely, you need to understand, if you're a physician or your radiologist, you get a report after a mammogram says you have dense breast, just don't say that's great. You need to understand what it means, and we can tell you in a future episode what you need to do about it.
Right.
I want to bring one more thing to life because of the Mad Men thing. Mm-hmm. This is real. My father-in-law, who passed away a few years ago at 90, he worked for a major construction firm that did bridges and vessels and big stuff. They were big time. Mm-hmm. And I remember him telling me how he got scolded and berated by his boss because the expense reports were too weak. He wasn't taking people out to 3 martini lunches. He wasn't taking them out every night to dinners. And this was an expected behavior, and actually got dinged a number of times because he was not spending the money they wanted him to do. Yeah. I also remember my mother sending me down to the Eisner food store to get cartons of Carringtons. And back to your piece on the physicians, I think there's a little bit of difference. I grew up, as you know, in the radiology department. Mm-hmm. And I remember going into the reading rooms in the hospital. You couldn't hardly see the films. We didn't have packs. We had films. Right. Because the radiologist was smoking cigarettes. All day, yeah. I remember going to my first tumor board, and I couldn't even breathe in the room because most of the physicians were smoking cigarettes.
Oh, yeah. So
this is very...
And this was after the Surgeon General's report, when you would have thought that physicians by then would have been aware of the link between cancer and cigarettes.
Exactly. I know you're going to remember this, because back to your point about women not putting up, but wanting to be better and equal to men. Mm-hmm. Remember Virginia Slims?
Oh, yeah.
I think their tagline was, "You've come to your time now, baby," or something. I can't remember exactly, but well, you finally got there because you can smoke with the man.
You can smoke with the man, and you can get lung cancer just
and you can die with them at the same time.
Yeah. Well, it was an interesting period of time, and of course, you and I grew up with it, and we lived with it, and I'm happy to say that I when I was a child, you didn't go anywhere that you didn't find a yellow film on white walls because everybody smoked cigarettes.
I burned all my clothes when I moved out of the house.
But these were the things that we grew up with, and thankfully, we aren't like that today.
It wasn't that many years ago. I think it was in 1998 when I went to Europe and took over the operations in Europe. Mm-hmm. It was in Amsterdam, actually, where the office was, the main office. You couldn't breathe in that office. Oh, yeah. So the first thing I did as the general manager, I banned smoking. Mm-hmm. They almost killed me.
I bet.
They wanted me gone.
Well, it's an addiction.
So it's an amazing thing, to be honest with you. It killed both my parents.
Yeah.
I directly recall that. But so I think we'll wrap it up here.
Mm-hmm.
We're through about 1964, heading on to 1980.
Mm-hmm.
This next session you don't want to miss. It's about the Kennedy-Johnson era. As I said before, this will really lay the groundwork for our present Medicare and Medicaid situation.
It will.
So don't miss it, and we'll see you on the next episode.
See you guys. Bye-bye. You've been listening to Health Reform 2.0 with your hosts Tom Locher and Tim Henning. We hope you found the topics interesting, that we answered a few questions, that you laughed a bit, and were entertained. Please feel free to invite your friends to join the discussion, and remember, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Send us your questions to info@hr-20.com. We hope to see you again next time.